Hello and welcome to Middle East Matters on France 24. A critical situation in Iran. The UN denounces the killing of hundreds of demonstrators across the country over the past 2 months. Tehran, meanwhile, stepping up its uranium enrichment amid a deepening dispute with the UN's nuclear watchdog. The 2022 World Cup in Qatar becomes a focal point for geopolitics. Iran's team refuses to sing their national anthem in a gesture of support for protesters, while Western teams attempting to show solidarity with LGBTQ populations are overruled by FIFA. We'll get a rundown with France 24's Jean-Emile Jammine. And Turkey threatens a ground invasion into neighboring Syria after hitting Kurdish militant groups there with airstrikes, in what Ankara calls retaliation for a recent bombing in Istanbul. Thanks for joining us. We begin in Iran, where state media says the country's nuclear program has begun enriching uranium to 60% purity at its underground Fordo facility some 100 kilometers south of Tehran. The procedure, using advanced centrifuges, brings the Islamic Republic one step away from achieving weapons-grade fissile material. Iran insists its nuclear ambitions are for peaceful civilian energy supplies. The latest announcement, though, comes amid deepening disagreement with the UN's nuclear watchdog. Jenny Shin reports.
Upping the ante in its nuclear program, Iran says it's begun enriching uranium to 60% purity at its underground Fordo nuclear plant, in response to a resolution passed by the IAEA Board of Governors. The resolution orders Iran to cooperate with the agency's investigation into alleged traces of uranium found at 3 undeclared sites, claims that Tehran has long dismissed. The UN watchdog has also criticized Tehran for barring access to the sites for monitoring, especially since surveillance was removed 5 months ago. The developments have thrown another wrench in efforts on reviving the 2015 nuclear deal, which eased sanctions on Iran in return for curbs on its nuclear program, until the US pulled out of the deal under then-President Donald Trump in 2018.
The reason that the negotiations did not come to an end and the related parties cannot resume the implementation of the nuclear deal is obviously because the U.S. lacks political will.
Iran's enrichment activities have since pressed forward. The country's Natanz facility is already enriching uranium to 60% purity, just one technical step shy of weapons-grade levels of 90%.
Meanwhile, Iran has hit several areas in Iraqi Kurdistan with drone and missile strikes. Iran's Kurdish regions have seen some of the strongest opposition to the country's theocratic regime amid 2 months of widespread anti-government protests. Well, that movement was initially sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish woman, after she was arrested by the country's notorious morality police for allegedly wearing her headscarf improperly. Tehran has accused Kurdish separatist groups in eastern Iran of stoking the unrest. The United Nations, meanwhile, has denounced an increasingly repressive crackdown on those protests in Iran. UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk says the situation is critical. NGOs are reporting that Iranian security forces are using not just live ammunition, but heavy weapons against demonstrators, with more than 300 people killed since the protests began, including dozens of children. Iranian state media, meanwhile, has confirmed the detention of 2 of the country's most prominent actresses on charges of security violations and anti-regime propaganda. Hengama Ghaziani and Katyun Riahi were arrested after they appeared on Instagram without headscarves and expressed solidarity with protests. Well, Tehran is actually blaming protests for the stinging defeat of its national team in the World Cup. The Iranian side went down 6-2 against England in their opening match on November 21st. Some Iranian visitors did indeed take the opportunity to support the anti-government protests back home with signs and chants outside the stadium in Doha. Inside on the pitch, the Iranian team itself made a highly symbolic gesture of solidarity with demonstrators, refusing to sing their country's national anthem prior to kickoff. Here's the team's captain.
We have to accept the fact that the situation in the country is not good and that our people are not happy. Everyone is unhappy, but that's no reason not to be their voice and not to respect them.
for some more on the World Cup action. I'm joined here by France 24 sports editor Jean-Emile Jammine. Jean-Emile, let's talk about Iran. There's been a lot about the team going into the tournament. Do you think political issues back home did affect their performance?
Well, you have to say with a 6-2 result, and Iran, bearing in mind we're ranked 20th in the world coming into the World Cup, you definitely have to say, even against England, that result was something psychological. And of course, Coach Carlos Queiroz, Iran's coach, he did try and defer those questions about the protests back in Iran away from the team. He said it wasn't their players' responsibility to come out and show any kind of support, but ultimately it was down to the captain who basically then led that protest to not sing the national anthem just ahead of the game against England. And that in itself was seen as quite a big statement. You have to bear in mind the consequences of going against the regime for a sports person. But the team looked flat, they looked insipid, and clearly something was on their mind. And you have had now players saying they have to take a stand, they have to at least show some kind of support. It's a very difficult situation, though, for those players.
A lot of pressure on those young players in a difficult political situation indeed. Well, how about Saudi Arabia? There have been already some shock results. We had Saudi Arabia beat Argentina. How important is a result like this?
Well, massive. I can't overstate. It is one of the shocks of World Cup history. Saudi Arabia is a footballing nation. It is football mad, despite not having a traditionally powerful team. They reached the next stage of the 1996 World Cup, 1994 World Cup rather, and that was the last time that they actually progressed from a group. That was their first ever qualification. They've qualified 6 times but never made it past the pool stages. In fact, we remember against Russia, the opening game of 2018, they lost 5-0, that team. So now under Hervé Renard, the Frenchman, showing an unbelievable amount of character to get past Lionel Messi's Argentina, who looked, by the way, as if they were going to take the game. It was 10 minutes on the clock when Lionel Messi struck his penalty to put Argentina ahead. And then they just showed that high intensity press and such a structured team resolve to then dismantle the Argentines. What an incredible result at the Lusail Stadium. And for the likes of Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, this bodes incredibly well, just in terms of the fact that Saudi Arabia has been trying to position itself in the sporting world. We have the PIC investment group taking over Newcastle United in the United Kingdom, obviously linked to the Saudi state, and you have all these allegations of human rights abuses which they are trying to steer away from. Obviously, the murder in cold blood of Jamal Khashoggi. And so the Saudi state is trying to show itself as a sporting nation to kind of take the talk away from that in many ways. And now this result will basically show that all that investment, all that effort that they've made into putting Saudi Arabia on the map in a sporting sense is bearing fruition.
Big move for the Saudis there. Well, let's talk about the host Qatar. Their football not pretty in the opening match, we can say. What has the country been doing to try to improve its image and ensure a legacy within the sport?
Well, you hit the nail on the head there, though. That football that we saw in the first game, absolutely insipid. A 2-0 loss to Ecuador. There were many fans who left early in the game. They didn't want to see it. But it is remarkable just how uninterested the host nation has been in their home team relative to previous World Cups. That's really not the focus. It's all about bringing those international stars to Qatar. Nonetheless, you really do want to see your team not be the first one to ever lose their opening game. So I just want to talk about their legacy. Qatar did start in 2004 an academy, the Aspire Academy, the cost of $1 billion. And it was, touted as one of the big success stories of Qatar. And indeed, it has proved fruition. In fact, I can give you the statistics here. 18 of this Qatari 26-man squad came through that academy, which is designed to bring up and-coming athletes. So you are seeing that Qatar has at least tried to push through a generation of players. Quite a difficult thing to kind of, make it, manufacture it from scratch. But one of the big hopes and one of the big fears at the same time is, can Qatar continue this legacy and make sure that the World Cup leaves some kind of an impact in terms of growing the sport, in terms of making it ultimately a footballing nation?
A heavy lift for Qatar, an expensive lift as well. We'll see what comes out of them from the next coming years in the sport. Jean-Emile Jammine, France 24 sports editor, with that analysis. Next, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is threatening a military ground operation in neighboring Syria. That comes after a series of Turkish airstrikes against Kurdish groups in both northern Syria and Iraq in retaliation for a bombing in central Istanbul in November in which 6 people were killed. Ankara is blaming that attack on the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, both of which deny any involvement. Fraser Jackson has the story.
Turkey has embarked on what it deems a retaliatory military operation. Following last week's terror attack in Istanbul, the country has unleashed waves of airstrikes on Kurdish areas of northern Iraq and Syria.
With Operation Claw Sword, 89 terror targets, 81 targets in the first stage and 8 others Sunday morning were destroyed, including shelters, bunkers, caves, tunnels, ammunition depots, and so-called headquarters and training camps belonging to terrorists who threaten our country, nation and border security.
Turkey holds the Kurdish Workers' Party, or PKK, responsible for the Istanbul bombing that killed 6. But the PKK and their Syrian allies, the Kurdish People's Protection Units, or the YPG, have denied all involvement in the bombing. Since 1984, the PKK has fought an armed insurgency in Turkey, which considers the YPG as an extension of the outlawed PKK. The conflict has since killed tens of thousands of people. Ankara claims the Istanbul attack was ordered from Kobani, a Kurdish-majority town in northern Syria near the Turkish border. The town was at the center of the world's attention in 2014 when it was captured by the Islamic State group. They were later driven out by Kurdish fighters.
That's it from us. Thanks for joining us here on Middle East Matters on France 24. Stay tuned. There's much more world news and information coming up in just a moment's time.